Even in the command post, the Admiral could hear the random shots of artillery that were being fired out. He studied the holomap and was just absolutely confused at how this happened. Taking this planet should have been easy. The Facadrel forces seemed very thin when they scanned the planet multiple times, but as it turns out, the Facadrel were dug in very deep. As their support units would say, dug in like a tick, though they weren't exactly sure what the hell a tick was. The amphibious reptiles proved very sneaky, ambushing from everywhere. Behind every single piece of foliage, there was a barrel of some sort of weapon. Behind every rock, under each rock, underfoot, jumping over top, they just seemed to ambush from anywhere, and before you could even do anything, your forces were being torn apart. Though the major battles they were winning, they were still being pushed back further and further and further. Even after taking large swaths of lands, battle lines remained extremely fluid as he watched on his holomap as another line seemed to expand and another one seemed to shrink at the same time. He watched and worried that they were going to lose another section, as they would be cut off, surrounded, and then eventually overrun. He thought to himself, how could these lizards be so difficult? How? Another rock of artillery strike takes him out of his stupor. He wished he could call for more forces from his own fleet, but the dipstick forces were simply scattered too far due to the war, so calling in reinforcements would not just be difficult, it was going to be impossible. The only other forces he had to call on this entire rock was the Allied forces, this new species, this backwater species that was from the middle of nowhere cubed. What the hell could they possibly do? He looked at the map and saw that their lines had not moved, thinking to himself that they must not have ever updated anything. They'll soon be overrun, but then again, he doesn't have a choice. He needs to call somebody. His lines are going to break. I mean, if the lines are truly where they are, then this new support unit, somehow they've been able to beat the Fuckadrill. How? Screw it. He didn't have time to worry about that, as more alarms and more of his staff were screaming into their communication device. Airstrikes and artillery were continuously getting closer and closer. He could hear screams about enemy inside the wire as they pushed through, and the lines were beginning to totally collapse. The Admiral suddenly screamed out, "Fragate! Call the humans!" "Sir?" "I should call them now!" A few moments later, a hollow image came up. The Admiral noticed the bipedal form of this thing, this pinkish blob that seems to be sitting there in an absolutely clean uniform. Nothing was being scattered around him. No one was moving. Everyone seemed fairly calm. He was upset about this, yet arrogantly yelled, "How have you been able to hold your lines?" "With ease, Admiral. May we be of assistance?" "We require evacuation." "On the way. 3 minutes." "Aren't we going to discuss—" Before he could even finish, the line was cut. Within that 3 minutes, hell rained down as the Fuckadrill just pushed deeper and deeper into the territory, cutting more and more people off. He could hear a few of his own screeching in pain as the wounded were being brought in and the random artillery shell came through. Computers saying how the loss of the base was absolutely imminent. He saw it come across the screen as his cold blood ran even colder. The Admiral then hung his spikes low down his back. He knew that his forces were in a fighting retreat back to his command post, where they would make their final stand, and they would die gloriously if they didn't get any reinforcements. He tried to steel himself, but he still looked around the room, realizing that he was in charge. It was going to be his failure, and he would live on in the history books as the one who lost the planet, who could not fight the Frecathrill at all. How embarrassing, how dishonorable. It's a good thing he wouldn't be able to face his mate ever again. He would not be able to hang his head high ever again. Oh, how did it come to this? As he thought this, the planet seemed to explode in several different directions, the command post shaking with every single impact. He looked out across the side. He couldn't get any videos, but he looked and he saw massive plumes of smoke and dirt and debris flying into the air. What was in there? Fricadrille bodies as well, at least parts of them, flying all over the place. He had been surrounded on 3 sides, and yet now all 3 sides seemed to simply explode. Something was coming in. He could hear the whizzing through the air, a strange whipping sound through the atmosphere, and then more explosions. The artillery barrage now continued for the 3 minutes it took for the humans to get to him. Then suddenly their artillery just stopped. Everybody thought for a moment that maybe the human artillery was their way of support. The Fricadrille must have actually found them, probably silenced them. But then they heard something else. The thunderous scream of aircraft screeching across the atmosphere, gliding in so close that the draft from underneath the wings was enough to once again shake the CP. It was enough to even pull debris off the ground as they came in so low, suddenly lifting up as they dropped canisters full of something that seemed to explode and burn, latching itself onto everything. They could hear the screeching of the approaching forces just burning up. He looked over and they were simply on fire as they raised themselves up in their last moments of pain, covered in flame as the flame itself ripped the air out of their lungs and scorched them from the outside in. Behind that was a whole bunch of high explosive rounds that crashed in. Some of these seemed to be guided, most not, but when they landed with even more force than the artillery, crashing in and blowing more positions apart. Then these aircraft turned around with a grace and speed he wasn't expecting, and then he heard this strange sound. He didn't know what it was, but then he realized, as what it seemed like something was sawing through the air, it was. They were using gun runs to tear apart the last of the forces in front of them, forcing them back, giving those on the ground time to land, that is. The transports landed, and armored humans started running out, firing as much as they could into the enemy lines. These exosuit covered with weapons all over the place, many of them up on the shoulders, some of them on the head, many on the arms, and they still carried other weapons, some of them even on the legs. It seemed as though they just had to stand there in these walking weapons platforms in the shape of humans. Were these robots? They didn't know, nor did they care. Many of these armored beings rushed to the lines and retrieved as many of the wounded as possible, some of them dropping the weapons off their shoulders just to shove more wounded over their shoulders as they ran back again with tremendous speed, not hesitating, many of them going back 2, 3, 4 times, coming back, sometimes with missing limbs, some with holes in them. You could see the red blood coming out. It was astounding. The wounded on the transports, as soon as they were fully loaded, some looked like they were overloaded, and yet they still got up and left. The Admiral was suddenly furious that the transports left them all to die and just took the lowest of their own forces. I'm more important. My staff is more important. He turned over to one of the humans, one with some sort of strange insignia he recognized. This was a commander of the human forces. When he reached the commander, he just about swatted the commander and said,
"The transports have left."
"Yes."
"You sent them away. How are we supposed to evacuate? How are we supposed to get out of here?"
The commander simply turned, said, "Simple." He raised his weapon before speaking again. "You just have to do 2 things.
"And those are?"
Shut up and get behind me." "Sir." And with that, All the humans surrounded who was left, and they began a running firefight out of there. All sorts of aerial vehicles began to swoop in and drop all sorts of ordnance, along with doing gun runs right behind them. Some of them so close that the draft from behind the wings actually picked them up off the ground. The humans seemed to have some sort of booster on their exosuits, as they would simply jump, extend these strange rockets, and then extend their jump 20, 30, 40 meters into the air, catch those that were in the air with surprising grace, and bring them back to the ground. And then they would put them on their feet, and they would just keep going. As they finally crested the hills off in the distance, they turned back towards their former base. The commander was upset.
We cannot allow them to maintain it. We must take it back. Do you have additional forces?
No need.
But the intel, the intelligence that's there, we must destroy it.
The human simply raised something on their arm, said 3, 2, 1, and then pointed with his hand with all the fingers extended towards the base. And then it seemed like every single artillery piece on the entire planet rained down on the base they were in, crashing it, crushing every single bunker. Every single structure was blown to tiny, tiny little pieces. Every being that was in there was now even smaller pieces, some of them with direct hits and completely atomized. The CP could be seen taking an absolute direct hit as the penetrator went in and suddenly leaving a giant crater where the CP once was. Before they took off again, one of the humans said, "Well, if they can get any intel out of that, I'd be impressed." Before anybody had to say anything else, the humans continued to move out, dragging everybody else with them. The Admiral was amazed. They watched the humans shoot, move, and communicate so efficiently it defied logic. How could a backwater planet be so good at this? He's heard the rumors, but they couldn't possibly have been true, that they had been at war for, several centuries, trying to kill each other, trying to make war their own pastime? No, it couldn't be. Yet as they ran, he saw that the humans all kept the perimeter around him, kept it tight, making sure that whenever a human couldn't stay in position, he was simply rushed into the center, and then that hole was completely closed up. What astounded him even more was the fact that it should be very difficult to end the enemy with those primitive kinetic weapons they use. You should be using some sort of photonics, maybe plasma, anything except kinetics, because they don't seem to work. Against the enemy, it usually just slows them down. It won't stop them, but for some reason, these kinetic weapons are not just able to stop them, but break the enemy into pieces. After one of the enemy actually jumped up and tried to ambush them along with about a half a dozen of their friends, and they saw that the humans had actually brought some sort of blade inside their armor. If things were too close and too dangerous to be using their kinetic weapons, they seemed to extend these blades from their arms, sometimes from their legs, and they began to slash and gash and put a hole in the ass of every single one of their opponents. It was horrifyingly efficient. As they continued to make distance, the dipsticks constantly began to drop gear, everything except their weapons, to keep up with the humans. Many of them said frag it and just dropped their weapons because they couldn't keep up. Many of them were so exhausted that they just couldn't keep going and fell. They were absolutely shocked that a human would always be right there and simply pick them up, throw them over that giant metal shoulder, and just keep going. How far can these humans run is all they could figure. As they got about halfway to their destination, all of a sudden they heard, "Get down!" And everyone dropped. Seeing the humans fall to the ground, everyone clearly did the same thing, because if the humans are getting out of the way, you might want to listen. As they hit the ground, tank shells went flying right over their heads, right past them, only a few meters away, crashing into the enemy lines that were making their way close. The admiral, along with a few others, turned and were astounded at this. How in the hell could they be that accurate? Then they looked over and they saw that the humans were moving forward, but this time they were crawling if they had to make sure that the tanks had a clear shot. Well, this was actually a reprieve because the insectoid race is a whole lot better at crawling than it is at running. They kept up with the humans on this as they crawled all the way past the tanks as the tanks made their way forward. But as soon as everybody was past, the tanks seemed to simply spin the lower half and continue their way forward, firing behind them, making sure that everyone made it back. Then they received another shock. The tanks were not alone, as strange walking weapons platforms began to take positions right behind the tanks and began to hold the enemy back with withering fire, many of them having several types of mortar tubes out the back, missile launchers, rocket launchers, all sorts of guns. Some of them had energy weapons. It was just insane. As soon as they finally got past the walking weapons platforms, they got back on their feet, saw the humans take off running, and, well, again, if a human's running, try to keep up. They did not stop until they actually got to the human base. Even when they saw it in the distance and the fire was a distant memory in the background, they did not stop. Many of them, once inside the base, simply collapsed on the ground. But there was something that kept them awake. They realized that even though it was a rear area, the rest of the planet had been torn apart. Their enemy had just dismantled everything else, and yet they looked around. There was absolutely no destruction to the humans at all. They could see towers that were manned, weapons that were almost still warm, some of them that seemed to be looking up, many of them looking out, but inside it was clean, organized, very well built. Crawling through, even with the aid of humans picking them up and dragging them forward, you wouldn't think there was a war outside the walls. How the hell? They all thought. They were all immediately taken to the aid station to be treated, most of which was simple dehydration or malnutrition, as they had been fighting for so long that they were just completely wore out. They were amazed at the care all the humans took to treat them, putting on several IVs, treating their wounds. Just everything was so well done. They were amazed at this. But what amazed them even more was the fact that you could see humans that were clearly missing parts. Some that were bleeding on the floor from inside their suits, yet they seemed to deny any type of medical treatment until all the dipsticks were taken care of. That, what? Don't you take care of the most valuable ones? Don't you take care of your own first? And if the others survive, you take care of them? That's standard, is it not? Apparently not for the humans. The Admiral just couldn't figure out how the humans were able to do all this, keep everything maintained. After being treated, they were brought over to get food and water, which many of them simply gorged on. Their insectoid bodies had completely been burned out of their nutrients and they need to refresh them. The humans kept saying, "Slow down, you're going to explode your stomach." Many of the dipsticks actually laughed because this was not actually possible. They could consume 3 times their own body weight and that wouldn't happen. Although they might get a really bad case of gas. After they got some food, even the Admiral was still amazed. There was one more surprise that they were not ready for. The dipstick forces were brought in mass, at least what was left of them, to several large temporary buildings that were set up. When they walked in, they realized this was an area for them to rest, to sleep, to recover. But it wasn't just an empty building. No, there were clean beds, fresh blankets. The Admiral actually had to close his own mandibles with his claw. How? What? This was amazing. He then turned over to the human commander, who finally took his helmet off and said, "I cannot give enough gratitude for our rescue and the sanctuary. This is
I don't. We don't have a word for things like this. What would you call something so wonderful after dealing with something so horrible?
The human began to stretch up the other end of its mouth, but remembered that showing the teeth might give the wrong impression. He tried not to chuckle when he raised both arms to represent showing the whole area and said, "Welcome to Shangri-La." Hello, everybody. This is Syntax. Thank you so much for joining me on today's story. Before I go, I gotta send out a quick thank you to one of my supporters. That would be the Guardian Sage. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Everybody else, I will see you on the next one. This is Syntax, ejecting.